I was born to be the poison that would rot the Iron Claw pack from the inside out, a witch hybrid hiding behind a scentless Omega mask. But the moment the Alpha King pinned me to the forest floor, he didn't rip my throat out. He felt my unhinged magic through a fated bond that shouldn't exist. Now, the man who executed his own mother for witchcraft is eavesdropping on my darkest secrets through a telepathic link. And I don't know what's more dangerous, the shadow seed in my pocket that will destroy his kingdom, or the fact that he's starting to crave the very monster he's sworn to burn. Hi! Welcome to Vine Romance, where love speaks and hearts connect. If you believe in beautiful love stories, hit subscribe, like, and comment. And kindly join our growing family. Let's grow in love together. Hiding a monster is easy. Until that monster decides to start screaming in the presence of a king. The fringes of ash felt like a graveyard. Every tree was a skeletal finger reaching for a sky that had forgotten how to rain. Freya moved through the grey mist, her boots barely making a sound on the charred pine needles. To any normal wolf, she was just a pathetic, scentless Omega, a ghost on the edge of the world. Truth be told, her soul was a riot of violet flames and jagged shadows. Because her coven had sown dark magic into her very marrow, her life was a constant, agonizing lie. She spotted the mountain elk. It was a massive beast, healthy and unaware. Freya didn't shift. Instead, she reached into that forbidden well inside her chest. She pulled. The air thickened. A sharp, but metallic tang filled her mouth, the taste of old copper and ozone. Without thinking, she pushed the magic out. It wasn't a clean kill. The dark energy lashed out like a whip of black glass, severing the elk's life in a messy burst. Freya gasped, dropping to her knees. A hot drip of blood hit her lip. Her nose was bleeding again. Disgusting, she thought, wiping the red smear away with a trembling hand. I am a weapon made of filth. She hated the static that buzzed under her skin, but more importantly, she feared it. Every time she used it, the coven's shadow seed grew heavier in her pocket. Moments later, a sharp, white-hot sting pulsed in the back of her brain. It was her mother, the High Priestess. The message was cold. Move. The king is at the border. Plant the seed or die. Freya's heart skipped. She looked toward the towering, jagged peaks of the howling crags. That was where the Iron Claw pack lived. That was where the man who hated magic most lived. Soon after, she was at the border. She looked like a beggar. Her clothes were torn and her hair was a tangled mess of midnight silk. She saw the pack wolves playing in a stream. They were laughing. They looked so simple, so clean. Deep down, she knew the truth. She could never have that. Her world tilted as she watched a young pup shift into a ball of fluff. It was beautiful. She wanted to rip it apart because the envy felt like acid in her throat. Next, she reached the heart tree. It was a giant silver-barked oak that pulsed with the pack's life force. This was the target. She pulled the shadow seed from her tunic. It felt cold, colder than ice. Her body moved on instinct as she reached out to touch the silver bark. "I'm sorry," she whispered in her mind, but then the tree fought back. As if the forest watched, a surge of pure golden energy slammed into her hand. The shadow seed flared violet. A shockwave of dark light exploded outward, snapping branches and hissing like 1,000 snakes. At that moment, Freya knew she had failed. The static in her head turned into a roar. What followed was a sound that made her bones vibrate. It wasn't a howl, it was a tectonic shift. The earth groaned. Before she could move, a shadow fell over her, a shadow so large it swallowed the sun. The air thickened with the scent of pine needles, thunderstorms, and absolute power. She turned. Standing on the jagged rock above her was a wolf the size of a mountain. His fur was obsidian, his eyes, they were molten gold. It was Alpha Valerius. Freya's thoughts spun. I'm dead. He's going to kill me and feed me to the roots. As if pulled by a string, the massive wolf leaped. He didn't shift midair. He slammed into the ground in front of her, the force nearly knocking the wind from her lungs. Freya scrambled back, her violet eyes wide and terrified. She tried to hide the magic. She tried to shove the violet flames back into the dark. As the silence roared, the wolf stepped forward. He pinned her. One massive paw pressed into her chest, not enough to crush her, but enough to make her feel every ounce of his weight. The moment their eyes locked, the world narrowed. A rip. That's what it felt like. Between one breath and the next, Freya felt her mental walls shatter like glass. It wasn't just a bond, it was a soul echo. A scream she hadn't uttered tore through her mind, but it wasn't her voice. It was his. Mate! The word echoed in her skull, layered with his shock and his sudden violent hunger. Freya's soul answered. It didn't matter that she was a witch. It didn't matter that she was a weapon. Her wolf pressed forward, whimpering for the touch of the black beast. But Silas, no, Valerius, felt it. He felt the violet static. He felt the unhinged darkness of the coven's magic leaking out of her like poison. Under the weight of his stare, she saw his pupils blow wide. He could hear her thoughts. He could hear her thinking about the shadow seed. He could hear her thinking about how his fur would feel between her fingers. Time stood still. Freya's voice trembled, though no sound came out. Please, her mind begged, don't look at the shadows. I don't see what I am. But the Alpha King didn't look away. In the span of a breath, he shifted. The process was a brutal liquid blur of muscle and bone. He stood over her naked and terrifying, his golden eyes burning with a mix of hatred and fated desire. Witch, he growled. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Freya's world tilted. Not only that, she felt the shadow seed pulse in her hand. If he killed her now, the seed would explode. If he let her live, she would destroy him. She didn't know what scared her more, his claws or the fact that her body was already arching toward him, desperate for a mark. And she let it happen. The scent of sulphur and pine was a suffocating wall between them, a physical manifestation of a bond that shouldn't exist. Freya lay pinned beneath Valerius's gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel the rough texture of the earth beneath her and the terrifying heat radiating from the man standing over her. What followed was a moment of pure, agonizing clarity. The soul echo wasn't just a connection, it was a leak. I can hear you, Valerius whispered, his voice a low, predatory rumble that vibrated in Freya's very marrow. Because his golden eyes were locked onto hers, she couldn't look away from the disgust and the raw, primal hunger flickering there. He wasn't just looking at her, he was looking into her, sifting through the violet static of her mind like a man searching through wreckage. Next, his hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her throat with a grip that was firm but not quite crushing. You are a weapon, he growled, the words dripping with a cold, jagged hatred. A creature of the coven, sent to rot my woods from the inside out. Tell me, why does my wolf scream that you belong to me?" Freya's thoughts spun, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in the back of her mind that she couldn't quite suppress. Because fate has a sick sense of humour, her mind screamed, the thought echoing in his head with the force of a physical blow. She felt him flinch, his pupils blowing wide as her unhinged magical energy sparked between them, a tiny jolt of violet electricity that made his skin hiss. Soon after, the silence was broken by the sound of approaching paws, heavy, rhythmic thuds that signalled the arrival of his patrol. Not only that, but she could feel the shadow seed in her pocket beginning to hum, responding to her elevated heart rate. To make things worse, if the other wolves saw the violet light dancing in her eyes, there wouldn't be a trial. There would only be a slaughter. "Get up!" Valerius commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. Rather than killing her, he hauled her to her feet with a strength that made her feel weightless. He didn't use the silver-tipped shackles his guards carried. Instead, he kept his hand clamped onto her arm, the physical contact turning the soul echo into a deafening roar of shared adrenaline. As they moved toward the howling crags, Freya felt the weight of the forest watching them. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of judging eyes, and every snap of a twig felt like a precursor to an execution. Still, she forced herself to keep her head down, her mind a frantic blur of calculations. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shut out the sensation of his pulse against her skin, a steady tectonic thrum that felt more like home than any coven ritual ever had. What's worse was the realization that the coven was still there, lurking in the dark corners of her consciousness. "Plant it now, Freya," her mother's voice hissed through the blood sight, a cold needle of ice in her brain. "The Alpha is distracted. Kill the king." Before she could move, Valerius stopped dead in his tracks. He turned her to face him, his eyes narrowed as he caught the echo of the coven's command. "Who are you talking to?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Freya's breath caught, her violet eyes flashing with a desperate, frantic light. I can't stop it," she gasped, her voice trembling for the first time. "They are inside me, Valerius. If you don't kill me now, you're bringing the plague into your own house." In that moment, the tension broke, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve in the Alpha's eyes. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he shoved her toward the massive stone entrance of the crags, a place of iron and ancient laws where magic was a myth used to frighten pups. Eventually, they reached the royal chambers, a high-ceilinged room carved directly into the mountain, smelling of cold stone and old wolf. Valerius threw her inside, the heavy oak door slamming shut with a finality that made her soul shiver. As the silence roared, she realized she wasn't in a dungeon. She was in his private sanctuary, trapped in the den of the man who should be her executioner. Without thinking, Freya turned to the window, the jagged peaks of the mountains silhouetted against a darkening sky. She felt the shadow seed pulse against her thigh, a reminder of the rot she carried. But as her wolf stirred, reaching out toward the man on the other side of the door, she felt something else, a tiny flickering flame of hope that was more dangerous than any curse. And she let it happen. The morning light in the howling crags was a pale, unforgiving grey that exposed every crack in the stone and every secret in Freya's heart. She hadn't slept. Instead, she had spent the hours pacing the royal chambers, her skin prickling with the electric static of her magic. Because the fated bond was now a permanent open channel, she could feel Valerius on the other side of the heavy door. A massive, radiating presence that felt like a hearth in a blizzard. What followed was a day of sensory overload that pushed her to her breaking point. She was forced to attend a pack feast, a primitive ritual of meat and muscle that felt like a direct insult to her refined, arcane upbringing. Every wolf in the hall smelled of earth and blood, their gazes heavy with suspicion as they looked at the omega their king had brought home. Next, a young warrior stood, boasting of a hunt, and his laughter was a jagged blade in Freya's mind. She felt a surge of unhinged irritation, and without warning the torches along the walls flared a deep, violent violet. The hall went silent. "Control it," Valerius's voice rang out, not aloud, but inside her skull, a deep commanding vibration that made her teeth ache. He was sitting at the head of the table, his expression a mask of bored indifference. But through the soul echo, she felt his heart race. He was terrified for her, not of her. Soon after, the tension broke as Valerius stood, dismissing the pack with a wave of his hand. Rather than returning to the safety of the chambers, he led her out to the high cliffs where the wind whipped her hair into a tangled web of midnight. The air thickened as they stood at the edge of the world, the drop below them a dizzying plunge into shadows. "My mother died on this ridge," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They found her with a vial of moon water and a book of shadows. I was the one who lit the pyre, because the law demanded the Alpha's heir be the one to purge the rot." Freya felt the weight of his stare, a physical pressure that made her chest ache. She didn't know what scared her more, the coldness of his words or the raw, the bleeding grief she felt leaking through the bond. Despite that, she reached out, her fingers grazing the rough wool of his tunic. "Then why haven't you lit mine?" she whispered, her voice a soft, trailing thought that echoed in the stillness. But then, the space between them burned. Valerius stepped closer, his scent of cedar and cold rain overwhelming her senses. He didn't use words. Instead, he cupped her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her lip. Because their pulses were now a synchronized drumbeat, she felt his unfiltered desire, a hungry, desperate need that made her magic purr instead of hiss. Moments later, a low, ominous rumble vibrated through the earth. It wasn't the wind, it was a mana storm, a side effect of her suppressed power reacting to the pack's ancient anti-magic wards. Not only that, but she could feel the shadow seed in her pocket beginning to heat up, a tiny coal of darkness that threatened to ignite the very mountain. What's worse was the sight of the pack elders emerging from the shadows of the great hall, their eyes narrow and their muzzles pulled back in silent snarls. They didn't see a fated mate, they saw a plague bearer. To make things worse, the violet static around Freya's fingers began to hum, a high-pitched sound that only a wolf could hear. "You're leaking, Freya," Valerius growled, his hand tightening on her jaw. "If they see what you are, I can't stop them. Not even for a mate." No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shut the darkness back into its box. Her thoughts spun, a chaotic riot of fear and the Coven's nagging commands. As the sky darkened with the approaching storm, she realized the ordinary world was gone forever. She was a witch in a cage of wolves, and the only man who could save her was the one who had every reason to watch her burn. In that heartbeat, the world shifted. She saw the first spark of violet lightning crack across the peaks, mirroring the fire in her own soul. As her wolf stirred, desperate to run or fight, Freya looked into Valerius's molten gold eyes and saw the truth. He wasn't just her keeper. He was the only thing standing between her and the pyre. And she let it happen. The violet lightning didn't just strike the peaks. It struck the very centre of Freya's mind, a jagged white heat that tasted of copper and betrayal. She stood on the precipice, her hair whipping like a flag of mourning. Yet as the first drops of rain hit the stone, each one sizzling as it touched the aura of her unhinged magic. Because the fated bond was now acting like a lightning rod, Valerius was shaking beside her, his molten eyes reflecting the storm she had brought into his home. What followed was a desperate attempt at damage control that felt like trying to hold back a flood with a handful of sand. Valerius grabbed her, his fingers biting into her shoulders as he physically dragged her away from the edge, his thoughts a roaring command for her to bury it. Next, he shoved her into a narrow stone corridor that led toward the heart tree's roots, a place where the mountain's own stone might act as a shield. Even so, the air thickened with the scent of ozone and the heavy, cloying smell of the shadow seed in her pocket, which was now vibrating with a life of its own. "You have to leave," Valerius hissed, his face inches from hers, his voice a jagged shard of desperation. "Not just the cliffs, Freya. The pack. My elders are already calling for the blood trial. If you stay, they will rip the skin from your wolf, just to see the colour of your soul." Freya's thoughts spun, her internal monologue a chaotic riot of self-preservation and a new terrifying loyalty to the man who was supposed to be her victim. Not only that, but she felt the coven's presence growing stronger, a cold pressure at the base of her skull that felt like a parasite. Rather than fighting him, she collapsed against his chest, her forehead resting against the hard muscle of his sternum. "I can't go back to them, Valerius," she whispered, her voice a soft, trailing thought. "They'll kill me for failing. They'll use the heartbind to turn me into a husk." Soon after, a shadow detached itself from the damp stone walls. It was the coven's high priestess, Freya's own mother, projected through the soul echo in a display of power that made the stone floor crack. The air went cold, a biting, unnatural frost that turned the rain to ice. What's worse was the mocking smile on her mother's face as she looked not at Freya, but at the Alpha. "How touching," the projection sneered, her voice a sandpaper rasp in their shared consciousness. The Alpha King and his little witch pet. But did you tell him the truth, Freya? Did you tell him that his own mother didn't just have magic? She was our sister. She was the one who stole the seed from us first. In that moment, the midpoint shift occurred, a revelation that turned Freya's world into a landscape of ash. Valerius froze, his hand dropping from her shoulder as if she had turned into a snake. The bond went cold, a sudden agonizing void that left Freya gasping for air. To make things worse, the Alpha's eyes turned a dark, lethal gold, his wolf surfacing in a way that felt like a death sentence. "You knew," Valerius growled, the word a tectonic shift that shook the corridor. "You knew my blood was tainted by your kind, and you used it to get close to me." No matter how hard she tried, Freya couldn't find the words to deny it because a part of her had known the coven sought a bloodline connection. Instead, she watched as the man she was beginning to love turned into the executioner he was always meant to be. Before she could move, Valerius shifted, a brutal, violent blur of obsidian fur and snapping bone, and let out a roar that signalled the end of his mercy. As the silence roared in the aftermath of his howl, Freya realised she was no longer a fated mate. She was a target. The elders were coming, the coven was watching, and the only man who could shield her had just become her greatest threat. As if fate demanded it, she turned and ran deeper into the mountain, the violet static trailing behind her like a funeral shroud. And she let it happen. The stone of the howling crags was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cold, airless tomb that echoed with the sound of her own frantic breathing. Freya sprinted through the lower tunnels, her bare feet slapping against the damp floor, while the violet static of her magic flared and hissed like a dying candle. Because the bond had gone cold, she felt a hollow, aching void in her chest where Valerius's golden warmth used to be. Truth be told, the silence in her head was more terrifying than the Alpha's roar. What followed was a desperate plunge into the dark. She reached the threshold of the dead zone, the twisted skeletal woods that bordered the packlands, where the Coven's scouts were waiting like vultures. Next, a shadow detached itself from a blackened cedar tree, and Freya recognized the sharp, cruel features of a high Coven enforcer. Rather than running back to the safety of the Iron Laws, she stopped, her chest heaving as she faced the monsters who had made her. "The Alpha knows, Freya," the enforcer sneered, his voice a cold slime in the night air. "He knows his blood is half magic, and he hates you for being the proof. Give us the shadow seed, and we will let you watch him burn." Freya's thoughts spun, her internal monologue a wreckage of maternal longing for a pack she had almost called home, and the jagged, unhinged instinct to survive. Not only that, but she felt the shadow seed pulse against her thigh, a coal of darkness that was now hungry for her very life. To make things worse, she saw a blur of obsidian fur at the edge of the clearing. Valerius had caught her scent. "I won't give it to you," Freya whispered, her voice a jagged shard of resolve. "I won't let you use me to hollow him out." Soon after, the Alpha King burst from the underbrush. He didn't shift. He remained in his massive black wolf form, his eyes burning like twin suns of molten gold. But then, he didn't lunge at her. Instead, he placed himself between Freya and the enforcer, his low tectonic growl vibrating through the roots of the trees. Even so, the air thickened with a sudden violent tension as the Coven's magic clashed with the Alpha's primal dominance. Moments later, the enforcer raised a hand, and the shadow seed in Freya's pocket turned white hot. She screamed, falling to her knees as the heart bind began to glow through her tunic, a violet web of light that looked like veins of poison. What's worse was the realization that the Coven was using her as a bridge to drain Valerius's strength while he stood in her defense. "Leave me, Valerius," she cried out, her mind a frantic blur of static. "The bond is a trap. They're drinking you through me." At that moment, the tension broke. Valerius shifted mid-growl, his human form emerging with a brutal raw intensity that ignored the magic searing the air. He didn't use a weapon. Without thinking, he grabbed her, pulling her against his bare chest, his skin scorching where it touched her violet aura. Because he was an alpha of the Iron Laws, he didn't flee the magic, he sought to crush it with the sheer weight of his will. "Let them drink," he growled into her ear, his voice a sandpaper rasp that made her soul shiver. I have enough blood to drown your entire coven, Freya, but I am not letting you go back to the dark. No matter how hard she tried, Freya couldn't push him away. Her world tilted as she felt his heart, a steady, massive drumbeat, syncing with her own chaotic pulse. As the violet lightning of her magic began to crawl over his obsidian skin, she realized he was taking the heart bind onto himself, sacrificing his purity to save the weapon that had been sent to kill him. As the silence roared in the clearing, the enforcer laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You've chosen a witch over your pack, King. You've committed to the rot." As if fate demanded it, Freya looked up at Valerius and saw the truth. He had crossed the point of no return. He was no longer the magic hunter. He was the mate of a monster. She felt the shadow seed ignite, the forest beginning to blacken as the final stage of the curse took root. And she let it happen. The forest didn't just go dark, it turned into a graveyard of twisted ash and screaming shadows. Freya felt her wolf spirit wither, a cold, hollow sensation that left her gasping as the heartbind reached its final agonizing stage. Because the coven had successfully anchored the curse into Valerius's blood, the sky above the dead zone began to bleed a sickly, bruised violet. To truth be told, the hope she had felt in the Alpha's arms was now a bitter, jagged shard of ice in her throat. What followed was a betrayal that felt like a physical blow to her solar plexus. As the violet lightning subsided, the pack elders emerged from the blackened tree line, their obsidian fur matted with the soot of the dying forest. Next, the High Elder stepped forward, his eyes burning with a righteous, fanatical hatred that mirrored the coven's cruelty. Rather than attacking the witches, the pack turned their snarls toward Valerius, who was still shielding Freya with his own battered body. "You have brought the plague into our blood, King," the High Elder growled, his voice a dry rasp of ancient laws. "Because you chose a witch over the pack, you are no longer our Alpha, or you are a carcass waiting for the fire." Freya's thoughts spun, her internal monologue a wreckage of guilt and the unhinged terror of seeing Valerius lose everything for her. Not only that, but she felt her magic being pulled from her body, redirected by the coven to bind Valerius in place. To make things worse, her mother, the high priestess, appeared in the center of the clearing, her hands glowing with a dark, rhythmic pulse that matched the fading beat of the heart tree. "Look at him, Freya," her mother sneered, her voice a sandpaper rub against her mind. "Look at the great king, reduced to a trembling dog because he loved a weapon. What would you have done in my place? I am merely finishing what your birth started." Soon after, the elders lunged. But then, they didn't go for the kill. Instead, they pinned Valerius, their claws sinking into his shoulders as they forced him to watch as the high priestess raised a jagged obsidian blade over Freya's heart. Even so, the Alpha didn't stop fighting, his tectonic roars echoing through the hollow valley until his voice broke into a pained whimper. Moments later, the world went silent. Freya felt the cold metal of the blade graze her skin, but it wasn't the pain that broke her. It was the look in Valerius's eyes. He wasn't angry. He was devastated. What's worse was the realization that her unhinged magic was now completely gone, leaving her as nothing but a human girl in a world of monsters. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words lost in the wind. "I should have known. I should have known I was only ever a trap." In that moment, the all-is-lost moment crashed over her like a tidal wave of black water. The coven began the final incantation, a low, rhythmic chanting that felt like it was pulling the very air from her lungs. Because she was no longer a witch and her wolf was dead, she had nothing left to fight with. No static, no fire, only the weight of her own failure. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a spark in the dark. Her world tilted as the high priestess leaned in close, whispering the final words of the curse. As the silence roared, Freya looked at the blackened heart tree and realized the fairy tale was over. The king was broken, the forest was dead, and she was the reason the moon had turned to ash. As if fate demanded it, Freya closed her eyes and waited for the darkness to take her. She felt the blade bite deeper, the bond between her and Valerius snapping like a rotted thread. In the quiet that followed, she felt the last of her warmth leave her body, leaving only the cold grey echo of a life that was never hers to keep. And she let it happen. The obsidian blade didn't draw blood. Instead, it drew out the final dying spark of the coven's hold on her. Freya felt the cold iron touch her skin, but rather than the end, she felt a sudden violent shift in the atmosphere, a crack in the void where the soul echo used to be. Because Valerius's grief was so loud, it acted like a beacon in the darkness, reaching into the hollow space where her wolf had died and pulling something new to the surface. Truth be told, the silence of her defeat was the only thing that could have let her hear the earth's true voice. What followed was a revelation that felt like a baptism in starlight. Deep down beneath the soot and the ash, she felt the roots of the heart tree begin to thrum, not with magic and not with wolf strength, but with a unified primal pulse. Next, she realized the heart bind hadn't just tied her to Valerius, it had tied her to the very soul of the forest. Soon after, the violet lightning in her veins didn't hiss with hatred. It began to glow with a soft lunar silver. "No," Freya whispered, her voice no longer trembling. "I am not your weapon, and I am not a trap." Before she could move, she reached out and grabbed the obsidian blade with her bare hand, the dark magic of the high priestess recoiling as if burned by holy fire. Not only that, but the blackened ground beneath her feet began to bloom with tiny, luminescent white flowers that fed on the curse itself. Rather than fading, Freya stood, her midnight hair shifting into a brilliant, ethereal silver that matched the rising moon. Moments later, she turned to the pack elders, her gaze so intense that even the High Elder flinched. "You fight for laws that were written in fear," she said, her voice a tectonic vibration that mirrored Valerius's power. "But the forest remembers a time before the fear, when the moon and the shadow were one." Still, the coven didn't yield. Her mother let out a shriek of rage, summoning a swarm of shadow wraiths to reclaim the clearing. Yet, the air thickened not with frost but with a protective, searing heat. Because Freya had finally accepted the unhinged duality of her soul, the wall between her magic and her wolf shattered. At that moment she shifted. It wasn't the brutal, bone-snapping transformation of the Ironclaw pack. Instead, it was a dance of light and shadow, a fluid, the shimmering expansion until a massive silver-furred wolf stood in her place, her eyes a swirling nebula of gold and violet. What's worse for the coven was the realization that she was no longer a hybrid. She was the lunar shadow, a legend the witches had tried to manufacture but could never control. With every heartbeat, Freya felt her power expanding, a tidal wave of silver light that washed over Valerius and dissolved the shadow chains holding him down. As the bond pulsed with a renewed blinding intensity, she saw him rise, his obsidian fur glowing as he absorbed her lunar energy. Between them something cracked, the last remnant of the heart bind, turning into a tether of pure, unfiltered love. No matter how hard the coven fought to maintain their grip, the forest answered to her now. She didn't need a final plan. She was the plan. As the tension broke, Freya let out a howl that wasn't a cry of pain, but a declaration of war, a sound that shook the very foundations of the mountain and called the ghost wolves from the shadows of the dead zone. As the silence roared in the wake of her howl, she looked at the high priestess and saw the first flicker of true terror in her mother's eyes. As if fate demanded it, Freya stepped forward, the silver flowers springing up with every stride. The final push had begun, and this time the weapon was the one holding the blade, and she let it happen. The final showdown wasn't a clash of claws, but a collision of two worlds that had been at war for 1,000 years. Freya, in her massive silver wolf form, stood at the center of the dead zone, her lunar fur radiating a light so bright it turned the night into a shimmering noon. Then, because she was no longer fighting her own nature, her unhinged magic had transformed into a calm, unstoppable tide of silver fire. Truth be told, the coven's darkness stood no chance against a soul that had finally stopped lying to itself. What followed was the total collapse of the coven's power. As the high priestess channeled the last of the shadow seed's rot, Freya didn't retreat. She lunged, her silver body a blur of starlight and fury. Next, Valerius was at her side, his obsidian fur acting as the shadow to her light, his tectonic strength shattering the arcane shields the witches tried to raise. Not only that, but the ghost wolves descended from the ridges, their howls joining Freya's in a symphony that reclaimed the forest for the living. Rather than a massacre, it was a purging. As the silver light burned away the corruption and left only the raw, honest earth behind. "It's over, Mother," Freya's voice echoed in the soul echo, a sound of finality that shook the high priestess to her core. Moments later, the high priestess attempted one final desperate curse, but before she could move, Valerius was there, his jaws closing around the obsidian staff that held her power. The wood shattered like glass. Still, the impact didn't just break the staff, it broke the blood sight forever. In that moment, the high priestess vanished into a cloud of grey ash, her legacy of manipulation dissolving into the wind. Yet, the victory wasn't complete until Freya turned towards the blackened heart tree and placed her paw upon its trunk. Because the bond between her and the Alpha was now a bridge of pure love, the silver light flowed from her into the mountain's veins. In the quiet that followed, the black bark began to crack, revealing a healthy, glowing wood beneath. What's worse for the old ways was the sight of the pack elders falling to their knees, not in fear, but in awe, as they realized their tainted king and his witchmate had just saved their lives. Eventually the dawn broke over the howling crags, but it was a different world than the one Freya had entered. The falling action was a blur of healing and heavy, meaningful silences. She shifted back into her human form, her silver hair now a permanent mark of her transformation, and found Valerius waiting for her. He didn't say a word. Instead, he draped his heavy fur cloak around her shoulders, his molten eyes soft with an acceptance she had never dared to dream of. No matter how hard she tried to find the words to thank him, she realized she didn't need to. Her soul answered him in the silence of their shared mind. As the truth unraveled, the pack accepted her not as a prisoner, but as the lunar shadow, the warrior queen who had brought magic back to the wolves. That night, they stood together on the high balcony, looking out over a forest that was no longer a graveyard, but a garden of silver and green. As if fate demanded it, Valerius leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "The cage is open, Freya. You can go anywhere." She turned to him, her violet eyes glowing with a steady, peaceful light. "I am exactly where I belong," she whispered, her voice a soft, certain thought. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted for the last time, and she felt the mark on her neck tingle. Not as a shackle, but as a promise. The fairy tale ending was no longer a dream, it was the ground beneath her feet. And she let it happen.